So Samuel has led Israel for 40 years, and after 500 years of continuous rule by the judges, his reign is coming to an end because he's getting old. He, like Eli, have trained his sons up in the priesthood, because they come from a priestly family, the priestly tribe, to take his place. But again, like Eli's sons, they've become corrupt and are not worthy of living or leading Israel, should I say. And again, like Eli, Samuel doesn't know that. But thankfully, this time, early enough, the leaders of Israel tell Samuel face to face that his sons are corrupt. And so they demand a king because they believe somebody else needs to lead them. So after coming out of a dark period of Israel's history, briefly under Samuel's reign, the leaders see that Israel is going to go back into dark times. Samuel not only was the religious leader, but the political leader, God's prophet. And this has been what God had designed for Israel. Not that kings should lead the nation, but godly men. So that people recognised that God was their true king. And they worshipped him as king and followed the lead of God's prophets and judges. But that was failing again. So we got moving into this sad time. And of course, Samuel is quite upset, really, with all that's going on. Samuel's obedience and dedication to God made him one of the greatest judges in Israel's history. There can be no doubt about that. But now, as he ages, the old cycles begin to reappear. Samuel's plan of grooming his sons into leadership had failed. Now, we don't know whether Samuel's a bad parent. We can't judge him for that because his sons are not following in Samuel's footsteps. And I dare say there's lots of us here and people you know who've led godly's life, yet their sons and daughters do not follow them. Doesn't mean to say that we are bad parents. It's one of the mysteries of life, and perhaps one of the things that goes with leadership roles. It's not always easy for children to follow in their parents' footsteps. I mean, in Samuel's ministry, we know that he was probably away from home lots of times. He would have been absent. And that's probably how his sons became corrupt. As he travelled the nation of Israel, taking God's prophetic message and ministering to God's people all over, he would have been away from home for weeks, perhaps even months at a time, and that's not easy for any family to cope with, is it? But they came with this request, the leaders. We want a king like other nations. And that brought sadness to Samuel's heart. In actual fact, although they weren't really rejecting Samuel, they were rejecting God. And it took Samuel a little time to understand that it wasn't him the nations were rejecting totally. They were rejecting God. And so Samuel turns to the Lord in despair and prays about the situation, about this whole thing, about whether Israel nation should have a king. This request, however, from the leaders of Israel is rooted in a sinful desire to be like other nations. By desiring a king like other nations, the people of Israel were rejecting God. And in many ways, it's going to be bad. They had seen what kings had done to other nations. Kings want a good alternative to God's system of judges and prophets. It wasn't a good thing. They seemed to think that the solution to their problems would be an earthly king. Why did they think that? Well, because everybody else had one. Every other nation around them, every other nation actually in the world probably had kings. So the people sought this solution. Let's have a king like other nations. The difficulty is, Israel wasn't like other nations. And Samuel knew this. Requesting a king to lead is tantamount to rejecting Samuel's leadership as a judge and prophet and as God as their king. And although Samuel was very much against this, his voice no longer carried that authority that he'd had in his life. In fact, the reverse effect. The people demanded a king in order to be like other nations, and that gave the momentum amongst everybody. Couldn't be stopped. Does that sound like other things that are going on in this world at the moment? With Brexit and with the Trump phenomena. I can't help relating the two, really, in the sense that people were dissatisfied with their political systems in North America and in England and want something different. And they're prepared to vote for something so different that reality, it could have bring about great damage to themselves and their nation. Don't want to get too political like John Burko at this time. I suppose a pastor should be independent of these political things. But I'm sure you understand where I'm coming from. And it would be right to compare Scripture with our current events. Because that's what's happening here. The people are disillusioned with God. That's the reality of the sin that's going on. They're not willing to trust God to lead them and keep them out of trouble. They see their neighbours, especially the Canaanites, getting stronger, and they feel threatened at this time. So God's response to Samuel is clear. Don't worry, Samuel. It's not you they have rejected, but they've rejected me as a king. Samuel warns against this change, but the people fail to hear his voice and take his guidance. But God does tell Samuel in plain terms, well, you tell them what the problem with having a king is going to be like.
He said,
"This is what the king who will reign over you will do.
He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your men servants and maidservants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day.
But the people refused to listen to Samuel.
No!
They said,
We want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles.
When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered,
Listen to them and give them a king.
Then Samuel said to the men of Israel,
Everyone go back to his town.
So he gives warnings that what the king was going to do. And the people don't take any notice. And what are these warnings? Well, Samuel says they're going to tax you. Kings need money to run a country. God is free, but kings cost money. They need palaces. They need to be fed. They need to entertain. They need servants and armies, and armies need horses and chariots and weapons, and they all cost money. And where's the money coming from? It's going to come from you. They're going to tax you. They're going to, in effect, take part of your land and your crops. Not only that, they're going to take your sons away to fight in armies and your daughters away to be servants to kings. Do you want that? You know, he's going to take large amounts of wine away from your vineyards. They're going to take some of your cattle away and your lambs. And you're not going to be so well off. But did this have any effect? No. Doesn't have any effect at all. The louder Samuel shouted, the louder his voice, the louder his objections, the more it went the other way. And again, has there been a comparison today to what we are going through? Well, of course, it was. The desire to be like other nations is overwhelming. It's like our desire to govern ourselves and not be governed by Europe becomes overwhelming, and despite the costs and everything else, the people cannot be persuaded. And what happens is that God agrees that that can happen. But Israel wanted to be like other nations around them, and that was never God's intention. God's intention was for them to be a holy nation, of which other nations would want to become like them. That was God's intention all around. Not like Israel became like everybody else. It is everybody else became like Israel. And that's the burden the church lives with today. It's not that God wants Christians to become like everybody else. He wants everybody else to become like Christians. That's the truth of the matter, isn't it? So the demand for a king is sinful. That's what this is all about. The demand for a king is in fact sinful. God had set out to create a nation in his image. That's what the Exodus was all about. And now Israel wanted a king in her image. And there are at least 3 ways in which Israel's request for a king may be critiqued, and which are bad. Let's think about it. There's comparison here with Adam and Eve. In that garden, when it all began to start to go wrong, as Adam and Eve were tempted to become more like God, they sinned. Because that's how sin entered the world. That was the real thing. It wasn't eating the apple, isn't it? What they wanted to be, Adam and Eve, was more like God. They had been given paradise to live in, and yet they were tempted not just to become friends with God and be led by him, but they wanted to become like him. That was the sin. And this is comparable with what's going on nowadays. You know, let's face it, many people in many nations in this world are not governed by kings or queens anymore, are they? In fact, Britain is pretty unique now. That's got quite a modern monarchy, and I don't know that there's any monarch anywhere else in the world that's got a government like we have. I think it's pretty unique and pretty wonderful and marvellous, because a couple of 100 years ago we changed into what we call a constitutional monarchy that gave the kings and queens a set of great rules. And so we're not like other nations, and I think it's important in many ways that we keep that way. I think it's a wonderful system of government that we've got a king and queen as head of state, and has got certain roles. She heads up the nation, but she's got no political power, has she? So she can keep separate. She can keep her relationship with each Prime Minister as they come and go unique. We know that the Queen offers advice from her vast experience, and she's got great talent in managing Britain's place in the world. And all this to do about whether Donald Trump should come and visit England. We'll never know what the Queen thinks of Donald Trump, but if he comes, she will host him as she hosts everybody. And that helps our country have a place, unique place in the world, because basically we know that Donald Trump wants to come to meet the Queen, doesn't he? He wants to ride in that carriage up and down the Mall. He wants to dine in Buckingham Palace, because that for him is uniqueness. That will lift his presidency to a different level, something that's uniquely looked after, and that's fine and great in monarchies. And we're thankful we've got a monarch who rules over us, who loves God and recognises his part in her life and in the life of our country. So that's good. Secondly then, not only did the demand for a king have sinful motives, the demand for a king is selfish in its timing. Yahweh is not opposed to kingship in Israel. In fact, there are indications in the early books of the Bible that God had always planned for Israel to have a king from the beginning. Are you surprised at that? Let's look at a couple of verses from Genesis. Genesis 17. God talking to Abram. Abram falls down on the ground because he's in the presence of God. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abram. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. God's promise to Abraham, not only will you be the father of many people and a great nation, but out of you will come kings. God also said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai, her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of many nations. Kings of people will come from her. So the promise to Abraham and Sarah was the fact that at some point in history, kings would come out of the Jewish people, out of Israel. So the problem with Israel's demands here is not the fact that they want a king, but they want a king now, not in God's timing. And isn't that a problem with us all sometimes? We want things now, and it's perhaps not the right time for us to have these things, not in God's timing. We often find it difficult awaiting God's best for us. We often demand things now and not in God's timing. Is it Abraham God talks to about this? What about Moses? When you enter the land of the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, you say, let us set a king over us like other nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own people. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Then and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom of Israel. So, the demand for a king is selfish in its timing, because there seems to be within the scriptures that God had always planned to have a king over Israel at the right time. And even here in the desert, during the Exodus, God is preparing and laying down some of the laws that a king should live by, and a king of Israel. And you can see that quite often these laws he laid down there were not obeyed, especially by Solomon and David and the other kings that followed, and indeed Saul, about the gaining of power and wealth. So thirdly then, the demand for a king is a cowardly in spirit. Israel did suffer during the Judges period. Neighbours always threatened them, and their neighbours caused wars and invaded them, but they generally overcome them. But that was not without losing property and people. We know that during the book of Judges. But what God wanted from people was a people of courage, to stand out and follow him and trust him completely. And when the people actually trusted God to deliver them from their enemies, God did deliver them. And so now they're taking the cowardly way out by demanding a king. They no longer felt they could trust God. And that's no different from us today, is it? Often, when we are facing problems, we don't trust God completely and do other things to perhaps circumvent, avoiding the mishaps and the difficulties we run into. And so very much today we might like to say that this passage has got a lot of contemporary significance going on, that Samuel felt rejected. We often feel rejected. But Samuel knew that he needed to get on his knees about this issue. And in fact, as he did that, God gave him a new task to complete. He didn't completely dismiss. Samuel didn't immediately fade away. He was there to give Saul, the new king, guidance and still leadership. He was still a priest and a prophet, even though there was going to be a king. God's prayers for Samuel were answered. God comforted Samuel in his feeling of being rejected. And so we shouldn't be surprised at that. Samuel was going to be there when the people were going to suffer the effects of kingship in their country for many years to come. So we see this passage about demanding a king is very much relevant to us today. We can often try and shortcut God, wanting things that are not really good for us, not really believing that God will sustain us, heal us, or whatever, or bring about a greater future for us and our families. But God always calls us to trust him. And of course we also realise in that sense we have a king that rules over us. That's Jesus. This is the beginning of kingship that God, I believe, was calling us people to. The people of Israel would have developed into a king in their own time. We know, and we look back, that the timing wasn't good for Israel to have a king. Their first king wasn't much good, and we'll deal with that next week. But we need to remember that Jesus is our king, and we need to put our trust in him despite the difficulties of life, and God will be with us through and through the difficulties of life. So let's look back on Samuel. When he was going through all these feelings of rejection and everything else, he did the right thing. He sought solace from God through prayer. He was always a man of prayer. He stayed a man of prayer. And he was sustained for the rest of his life. Let that be so with us. Now, next week, from a good king to a bad king will be our subject for next week.